each year, it's quite a tendency for us to kind of set ourselves some resolutions for this up and coming year. Just out of curiosity, how many people, you're allowed to put your hands up at this point, how many of you guys have made any New Year's resolutions? I'm not going to ask you what they are, they're completely yours, but have you made any New Year's resolutions this year? Okay, so a few, but then equally also not a few as well. So I'll let you know what some of mine were. One of mine was that I don't need to go back for thirds and fourths. I don't need that in my life. I'm definitely aware I've come out of lockdown a little more timber than there was when I went in. So yeah, and I just thought, you know what, actually, that's great. In our house, we have this thing that we purposefully cook for about 4 or 5 people with the idea that we then portion it off and pop it into the freezer. So that then when you've got a day where it's really, you're in and out of the house, you've not got time to cook, you've got something that's actually going to be really nice. But I'm aware less and less is going in my freezer and more is going in me. So that was my resolution for this year. Anyways, so for us as we're looking at this up and coming year as a church, I just want to kind of encourage us and just say, do you know what? Like, there's so much that we would love to be able to achieve in this up and coming year. As us as a church, like, what can we do as we're coming up and into this year? Well, in preparation for my talk today, we're going to be just reading a little bit of scripture just to start us off with. I'm reading from Philippians chapter 3, and I'm going to read from verses 2 through to the end, 12 until the end of verse 14. Luke got a bit scared then. I got wrong scripture. I do not mean to say that I have already achieved these things. Now, bearing in mind, this is a long letter, and he's been talking about all the stuff. So anyway, it starts off, he says, I don't mean to say that I have already achieved these things, or that I have already reached perfection, which is good to know, because if Paul's not reached perfection, then for us, that I know I'm not there yet myself. And so there's greatness in that. As he says, but I press on to possess that perfection for which Christ first possessed me. No, dear brothers and sisters, I have not achieved it, but I focus on this one thing, forgetting the past and looking forward to what lies ahead. I press on to reach the end of the race and receive the heavenly prize for which God, through Christ Jesus, has called us. So I start off by using this verse just as an explanation, really, as what it is that we're going to be looking at today. In that, the last couple of years, because of COVID, has actually been really difficult for many of you that are here. We just need to turn on our news and we can see that actually it's really difficult to be able to do a lot of things even at the moment, depending whereabouts you are within the UK. That this last year has had knock-on effects financially, it's had knock-on effects health-wise. I know that for myself, I came down with COVID. I've actually twice now, but this last time was over Christmas, and the fatigue that I was left with, I was really shocked by that it's taken me several weeks to kind of get any form of energy level, and so the knock-on effects of COVID is not just on what has it done financially to us as a country. It's also not just what it's done to us as the NHS and all the other areas, but equally I know the effects that it has on many people. I have friends who are still struggling with long COVID and who actually life at the moment still has not got any resemblance of what it looked like before. So as we come to this next year, there is an element of us going, do you know what, like this stuff that's not been great in the past. And I love this Bible verse because it starts off by saying, actually, I'm not going to allow that to be the thing that I'm looking at. Instead, I'm going to look forward to the thing that God has for us. And I think that that's actually something I just want for us to be able to grab hold of. Do you know, if you miss everything else I talk about, and that's the one thing you go home with, then you will be blessed today. Because so many of us have a tendency to carry our past around with us. past failures, past hurts, past disappointments, and that those are the things that actually almost identify us in the present. And in this Bible verse, Paul is suggesting that if he needs to do it, then actually I would suggest that perhaps this is something that we all need to do that. And it's this thing that pushing forward, forgetting the past and looking forward to what lies ahead. And I just think that actually this is something that each of us needs to learn to be able to do. And it's not a once thing and then it's done, but it's something we almost need to coming back to and just saying, do you know what? I'm not going to allow that. Whatever it is, whatever that past hurt, disappointment, failure, whatever that is, doesn't define who you are now. And as Paul is suggesting, it doesn't define who we are in the future. And so I just want, if that's the one thing that you grasp today, then I know you will be blessed by that. So I just kind of, as we look forwards, like what would we like to see more of in this up and coming year? As we move forward, what we'd like to see more of. And I've dotted down a few things that I feel that we as a church would love to see more of. We'd love to see more baptisms, wouldn't we? We'd love to see more dedications. We'd love to see more people coming to know the Lord Jesus as their Lord and Savior. Love to see more love in our active community. I'd love to see more initiatives, both within our church, but also within our local community and even further afield. Yes, we'd like to see more people in our church, but actually, wouldn't it be nice to see more social events as well at the same time as more of a depth of a spiritual reality. The God that we worship is more than what we can see and feel, and that this is one of the things that always grabs me, is that actually the God that we worship is beyond our understanding. There's an element of mystery. There's an element of that kind of aspect of it, and that I want to be able to see and feel and experience more of that in our church meetings, that it's not just coming and having a great feeling and then going home, but it's actually that I've met with a living God who is in our midst. And actually, if I was to go around the room and say, what would you like to see more of in church? I think the reality is that actually each of us could probably say something that was slightly different to the next person. However, what I'm also aware is that this never-ending list of stuff that we would like to see more of does two defined things. The first one is, to many of us, it's exciting. Like, wow, wouldn't it be great to see this? You know, an active mother and tots group up the top that's meeting, for example, or youth work that's just actually got teenagers coming from goodness knows where to come to, and all of this. We hear it and we go, yes, wouldn't that be amazing? But equally, there's another group of people who are hearing it and who are actually getting a little bit worried, because actually, statistically, now, I find this is I think it's quite a depressing statistic, but it's something that across the Western church is a fact. And it's this: 20% of the people within the church congregation do 80% of the work in the church. I'm going to say that again. 20% of the people do 80% of the work. So if you're listening to this never-ending list and you're feeling excited, that's great. But I can understand the 20% who are going, you want me to do more? It's like an element of like, oh, right? And I get that. So it just kind of led me to just kind of question, actually, like, what can we do? Imagine the amount of stuff that we at the moment as a church is doing. And actually, we've got a really good list of stuff that we're doing at the moment, and we're doing well. And I want for us, this isn't Phil standing at the front going, guys, you're doing a rubbish job, let's do more. Actually, I'm saying, wow, isn't it amazing that we managed to achieve what we've achieved? Isn't it great to see all of the families in our church? Isn't it great to see a coffee shop that's actually ministering to our local community? Isn't it great to see all of these things? And so I want for us to be able to take that. But if the statistic is even slightly correct, even if I was to say, well, Four Oaks Baptist Church, we're a little bit better than that. It's not 20%, it might be 30%, you know? What would it look like? What could we achieve if it actually was more like 50-50 or even more? What would it look like if we as a church were all involved and all doing stuff? Wouldn't that up the level of what we could actually achieve? And also level out some of the stress from those who perhaps feel like they're already doing quite a lot. Just as a thought. This is called Challenge Sunday. I'm purposefully trying to make you feel uncomfortable, all right? So don't worry about this. Okay, then the next question is this. Well, what is a church? What is a church? Well, I can tell you what it's not. A church is not a building, right? You know, it's not a place to which I attend, right? It's not a show. It's not a receive-only contract. And I say this because as church has moved over the centuries, there's been a distinct shift in the way that we do church. Now, once upon a time, I would say that actually if you were to ask anybody what is a church, most people would say that it is a building, right? And actually if I was to ask them to draw it, it would look like St. James's Church around the corner. It's that sense of, you know, actually we go to a building that is specifically built to look like a church, a place of worship. You can spot them on the horizon as you drive around. And so once upon a time, that would be what most people would say, what is church? And the answer would be the obvious. But as church has moved over the last, particularly century or so, you've got more and more buildings that don't look like churches. If you don't know what I'm on about, look around. There's no stained glass. We're not a building that is being built to be specifically a church. There's a real common push towards churches that look like warehouses, or literally people that are taking over warehouses in order to be able to do churches in them. See churches popping up in coffee shops. We see them popping up all over the place. There's a real distinct shift from what church looks like. But also with that has also come an element of that not only does church look different, but also what is expected of me. And our culture has shifted hugely as well. That we are, whether we like to admit it, we are a very capitalistic approach, and our approach to church also has got that element. So we're very business driven, but we're also massively consumeristic. And we would like to say that that's not the case. But if we don't like something, we'll move to somewhere else. That many people are prepared to drive past multiple supermarkets to go to their preferred choice of supermarket. The same goes for churches, that as much as we like to say that we're not, actually many people are prepared to drive all over the place to be able to find a church that they like. I was chatting to somebody the other day who drives all the way up to Leicester to go to a church. From here, all the way up to Leicester to go to a church that they enjoy. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with traveling. If you're somebody who travels to church, great, I think that's wonderful. But there's an element of we're aware that whether we like to admit it or not, that there is an element of what do I receive from church? And so if the worship's not the way I like it, or the songs are not the types that I like, or if the person who speaks doesn't speak in the way that I like, then actually eventually I'll find myself I'll move to somewhere else. So that's just something that's just worth noting. And so which is why I used the concept, a receive-only contract. So if church isn't this list of things, then what actually is church? Well, as I kind of flick through the New Testament, what's suggested as church is, instead of an I, it's very much a we. If you look at the birth of the church in Acts, there's this superb eruption of just people who are interested in each other. It says that they met in each other's homes. It says that they ate together, that they prayed together, that those who were in abundance with multiple properties and land would quite often sell stuff in order to be able to see that others' needs were met. The sense of we, a love for one another, an element of family and community and friends, all of which is centered in and on and through the person of Christ. So for me, this is what church is about. So when I actually say, what is church? I would probably say that it is a community of people who love one another and love Christ. And so the rest of it, all the other bits and pieces are almost on a periphery, that is centered on this aspect of us doing it together. Now, I keep talking about the journey that we as a church have gone on for the last essentially 5 years, because I can't talk any more than that because I wasn't here. In April, this will be my fifth year here. Can you believe that? It'll be my 6th Easter. It's incredible. Love it. For some of you, you've joined after, so it's almost like, well, Phil's always been at the church. But to many of you that are here, actually, some of you that are here have actually sat through 3 3 different ministers. I don't think there's anybody that's done the 4th, but yeah, I think there's an element of 3 previous to me. There we go. So yeah, but there's an element. So there is a life pre-Phil on that side of stuff. We've in the last 4.5, 5 years, we've gone from being what is a relatively small church, and for the most, a congregation of just over 25 people, age 17 above. That was the kind of, that's the way our church looked, with a real heart to see the church grow again. With a real heart to see more people involved, to a real heart to see the church younger across the board, and again to see children in our midst. For us to be a church that wasn't insular, but a church that was looking out. The church who actually made a difference in the community to where we were at. And was prepared to take a leap of faith in order to be able to achieve that. And actually, to the point that if it didn't work, then at least they would know that they tried. And so I'm saying they, because that was the journey just before the arrival of myself and many of you who are here as well. And so that's kind of where we're at. And so even by just looking around, you can sense that in the last 5 years, God's answered a whole series of prayers. And I just want us to be able to say this is something that we should be excited. I use the word proud of, but without being pride in self. It's a sense of like proud of like, I'm involved in something that God's doing and this is exciting. And I want for us to be able to feel that. In order for us to be able to move forwards and do more, it requires us to essentially do and give more. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few bits and pieces that are probably going to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, but don't worry, because the person next to you is probably feeling as uncomfortable as you. That's fine. And at the end of this, if you don't feel challenged, well, that's amazing. Probably you fell asleep. But yeah, so I'm just making you aware that this is something that we're kind of doing together. So as I start to talk about giving, and so financially giving, I know that there's an instant reaction within many people that are here. Some of you will just go, oh, this is the point where I can activate my imagination and just drift away for a moment, and maybe I'll come back in again and find something that's not going to offend me. To others, some of you will be sat here automatically trying to build up legitimate arguments to everything I'm saying. And to some of you that actually all of this is new, and you're going to be finding it quite interesting. What I would say is just before you kind of disengage, or before you find yourself finding arguments, just bear with me on the journey. And if you want to discuss this with me afterwards, I'm more than happy to chat through some of this. But we acknowledge as a church that we would love to be able to do more. And this is something that we've already said. And if I was to use the analogy of like youth work, because that's something that we don't have at the moment. We've got great children's work, but we don't have youth work. So if I was to use that as an idea and to suggest that if we were going to launch a youth work, that actually it would require people to take on that responsibility. It would require finances to be able to fund that activity. It would require time to be able to see that happen. So you can see already that there's multiple things that would be needed in order to be able to make that a reality. And I would say that at this point, we've got a great team of volunteers that do stuff. And so we have got this like wonderful group of people that are legitimately invested in this. I also need to give just a wonderful nod to what I think is my absolutely fantastic leadership team. And again, as we look to doing more across the board, I know that my leadership team, who are already, many of which have got jobs or lives that already take quite a bit, and then they're also doing loads of stuff within the volunteering aspect of stuff. That actually, as we talk about launching all of these new initiatives, I know that many of my leadership team are sighing inside, because I know that actually the idea of doing more, I'm trying to find ways to alleviate some of the pressures even of my own leadership team. One of which would be that in order for us to do more requires actually for us to have somebody who's gifted in administration to be able to take some of the pressures off many of the leadership teams, so that we can release them to do the stuff that they're actually gifted in, as opposed to doing stuff that they're not gifted in. To do, for example, stuff like responsibilities of the upkeep upkeep of our rentals, the upkeep of our website, or the upkeep of all of our rotors and all those sorts of things. Some people are naturally gifted that way, others are not. But if we were to say, just on that side of things, that we would like to be able to employ somebody as a church to be able to do that, that instantly, again, requires not just a person to do it, not just the time, but it also requires funds. So as I use the illustration of youth work, if I was to say the same illustration of an administrator, whatever it is requires actually a mixture of those three things. So, all of these initiatives, I think, are great, but the reality is at the moment that we cannot afford to financially do any more than what we're doing at the moment. Not without stretching into, for example, our bank account and actually using our reserves to be able to do half of these things. And then realistically, you can only carry that on for so long until there are no reserves. So with financing these things, it comes something which is actually quite difficult. Now, I need to make you aware that all of the finances that we have as a church, actually, majority of that comes from you. And that's from the offerings and the tithes that you give on a Sunday as the plate once upon a time was passed around. Wow, that's almost now resigned to history. We do have a plate, and it is for people to be able to put money in. But at the moment, again, we're trying not to pass things from one person to another. But the other way that we've started to give has been through bank transfers. Some people have got standing orders set up. And again, that this is something that actually allows us to be able to do. Some of our financing from the church does come from the rental of our rooms, which is to be said. And there is the exception, I might add, from the Sutton Coldfield Charity Trust. And that was what we got the money for to be able to do all of our extensive building work that's been done. By the way, if you've not seen the new church kitchen at the end of the service, I encourage just to go and stick your head in and have a look. It's very, very different, but it actually allows us to be able to do so much more. God's really blessed us. The olive branch, for example, yes, the olive branch actually does make money, but actually at this point, everything of that is something that only covers itself. And so we can't rest on that. So if we are to do more, like I said, it is your tithes and offerings that actually keeps the church able to do what it does. Okay, so I'm going to talk about just money for a little bit. I'm going to talk about the Bibles and Scripture as what it tells us about giving. I'm going to explain the difference between tithes and offerings, but I'm also going to explain just on a practical level, actually what that means across the board. So the first thing is, there's offerings and there's tithes. So the Bible talks about offerings all the way through, particularly the Old Testament, and there's a little bit of a mention of it again in the New Testament. And it's this idea that actually from what I have, from a place of thankfulness, I bring my offering to the Lord. Some of the offerings in the Old Testament were because actually as a way of saying, actually, I'm not perfect, and I bring my gift as a way of saying I'm sorry to the Lord. Now, thankfully, we're not a church that is involved in the physical offering of animals, which is the Old Testament. If it did, then it would be quite messy. I'm really grateful that that's not something that's needed today. Thank you, Jesus, on that one. But throughout the Old Testament, particularly as people became less and less agricultural natured, that they weren't able to necessarily bring their own animal. And so they would bring their finances to church and would either give financially to the church, to the temple at the time, or would, with that money, buy the animal that was needed. So we understand the concept of giving financially. Now, to some of you, actually, when you hear offerings, you initially just think of the wooden plate that gets passed around, and that's a great way of looking at it. Money given to special projects or for a special purpose. This is again quite often thought of as offerings. Now, the Bible talks about something called tithes, and tithes is a completely different thing altogether. And actually, throughout what's known as the books of the law, so the initial 5 books, which is called the Torah, if you're into your Jewish history, that there's a lot of talk in that about tithes. And it's this idea that because God gave the people of Israel the land of Israel, that they were then as essentially that they lived in God's land. And so he says, instead of me saying actually that I want you to give everything that the land gives, give it all back to me. He says, actually, I want you to give 10%. 10% of everything that's taken from across the land, whether that's in your animals, whether that's in your crops, even in your herb garden. There's an element of actually saying, if God's given me this, everything is his. And actually he's saying, give me back 10% of that. Now, why does he say that? Well, he's saying that because actually it's an element of I'm choosing to trust. And especially if you imagine you're physically taking in a harvest, that there's an element of this has to last me the year. And so you already start to kind of begin to process as how I'm going to use all of this. And God's saying, actually, I want from that first, not after you've taken all of the little bits and pieces out and you've paid back such and such money that you've borrowed and you've paid for your mortgage and all of these other bits and whatever's left is the 10%. He actually is saying from the initial harvest, it's called the first fruits. And he's saying actually that's from that initial amount that comes in, God's saying, actually, from that, I want you to give back 10%. It's an element of saying, Lord, not only am I thankful for what you've given me, not only am I from a place of gratefulness, but it's also saying to some people who are looking at it going, I'm not sure I'm going to make it through this year. But they're actually saying, I'm going to trust, God, that you're going to be with me through this journey. And that just as you've given me the land, just as you've given me the crops, in times of need in the future, there's a possibility that God will step in again. It's an element of trust as well. Now, as we move into the New Testament, I will point out that Jesus doesn't specifically teach upon tithing. However, it comes up multiple times in many of his talks. So, for example, he congratulates a religious leader for tithing. And then goes on and says, and it's great that you do that. I'm paraphrasing, by the way. Says, it's great that you do that. However, you're not doing these things. And so he's actually pointing out that actually, although you might be going through all the right stuff, there's areas in your life that's not right. And so, again, I think if Jesus had issues with tithing, he would have probably have used that as an opportunity to be able to say, actually, this doesn't stand. Also, at the time, the Pharisaic movement was really big on the legalistic side of religion. And so it's almost like Jesus, there's many stuff that Jesus doesn't teach upon, not because it's not relevant, but because actually it was just a taken that most people understood it. There was no point in harking on about stuff they understood. He was teaching about the stuff that they'd misunderstood. Yes, that makes sense? Okay. So again, coming back to that analogy of the 20% of people that do 80% of the work, this is not to make anybody feel like ashamed on this side of things. It's a challenge Sunday because it's challenge, all right? However, of the moment, our church, we've got over 90 people in our congregation that worship with us regularly. Of that, just over 70 adults, which I think is really exciting. I want to say it's wonderful. I know this, that we've got, there's 22 people who give monthly as part of a standing order. So that's what goes into the bank account. I know that there's money that goes into the plates. That's a different thing. But of that 22, 10 people give over £100 a month. Now, I'm saying those statistics because actually, if you look at it, again, the 20% and the 80%, I think that's even notable within the finances. And coming back to that statement I said before, what would church look like if the 20% of people actually, that wasn't only 20% who volunteered? What would it look like if we were able to have more people who volunteered, more people who got involved? On that same statement, what we are able to do as a church at the moment is fabulous. And as we look forward to the future, wouldn't it be amazing if we could do more? And again, that comes down to financially. What would it look like if instead of our 70 people, 22 people gave monthly? What would it look like actually if 50% of the church gave monthly? of that 70 people, 10 people are giving over £100. What would it look like actually if we were to have more people who looked at their finances and said, you know what, actually, I'm going to give. Now, I'm aware I'm saying this in January, which is probably the leanest month of the entire year, right? And so some of you are going, Phil, honestly, I'm not sure I can get to the end of the month myself, let alone give more. But I just want to kind of encourage, because this is something which is throughout Scripture. It starts off and it's majorly in those first 5 books. But then throughout the books of the prophets, there's a whole section where God's kind of saying to his people, listen, you're doing all of this, but you're not giving back to me. And it's kind of like almost a gentle rebuke. And actually, it's something that's there. It's something Jesus talks about himself. What would it look like if we were able to give more? Now, I know that some of you are looking at your finances and you're going, actually, yes, I've been tithing for years. I know there may be some of you who are actually here who your job has changed significantly in that time. And so maybe, yes, you were giving X amount. However, your job's changed and now you're not making anywhere near the amount of money that you earn. Maybe you actually need to take a look at it and adjust your tithe based on that. Some of you will have got promotions and actually found yourself in a better place. And for those of you, well done, great. But maybe actually you might be able to kind of take a look at what you give and adjust accordingly. To some of you, that the whole idea of giving 10% naturally causes your stomach to twist. And it's something that actually you're not giving, and the thought of you being able to give that is going to be really difficult because you're looking at your own finances, especially in January, and feeling that actually you're struggling anyway. But what I want to maybe encourage you, challenge you to do is maybe the 10% is difficult at this moment, but maybe you could give, just looking at your bank account and actually say, well, maybe I could give 5%. I'm going to trust God on this. And then next year, or maybe a couple of months down the line, realize actually I was surprised. I gave that as my bank account, as my paycheck came in, and actually I've noticed that I'm not missing that money, which is interesting. I know that when tithing is something that always made me feel really uncomfortable. So you're in good company. But I remember the first time that I started tithing, the idea of I've got my paychecks come in and I've given that 10% before anything's gone out, and just feeling like, wow, that was a real step. And then getting to the end of the month and going, well, it's actually surprising. I seem to have ended the month on exactly the way I was before. We just make adjustments. So there's a challenge. I said it'd be uncomfortable. Done, okay? Said it. But there's something to think about. As we look at again at that initial first list of all those wonderful things, wouldn't it be amazing if we could do more? Some of this is about building community. Now, growth has meant that, again, coming back to that initial thing I mentioned at the beginning, of we've got a great group of people who had a real desire to see the church grow. And over the last 4 years, that group of people have seen the church grow. And it's been something that's been really exciting. But at the same time, it's also been something which, if for some people, have found that it's actually been a time of alienation. And that's because going from a time where you knew everybody and there was friendships because you were all in it together, and then suddenly, within the matter of 2 to 3 years, the church has trebled in size. And actually many people are feeling that there's loads of faces and I'm really excited to see the church, but I don't really know any of them. And there is, if we can remember back in the middle of lockdown, we did a church members meeting. We had a whole group of people that in the last year or so had come to worshiping with us regularly and wanted to take church membership. And that was great. And as I'm putting forward all these people's names who wanted to take membership, there was a whole group of people going, I don't feel I can vote to say, yes, I want them as part of the church, because I don't even know who they are. I see the name, but I don't know who they are. And that made us as a church leadership kind of sit up and go, do you know what? We need to work on that. And many of you guys as families have rocked up and it's been great, and you might know a handful of people. How can we get to know everybody within the church? How can we widen that group of friendship across? And I would argue, and again comes to challenge, that this is intentionality. You've got to be intentional on building friendships. Often, if I come to church, keep myself to myself, and then turn around and walk out at the end, the likelihood is I'm going to feel that I attend church, but it's not something I'm part of. And so actually, I want to encourage you to be somebody who is prepared to build friendships. Some of this is down to us, as a church, doing some purposeful things. We've talked about doing post-service meals. So maybe on a once-a-month basis, kind of saying, actually, we're going to do a meal after church. Going to set out the hall at the back with a load of tables and chairs and have it like a real party environment and do some nice food. Well, in order for us to be able to do that, it actually requires people to do the cooking. And again, I just want to encourage, actually, maybe there's people that are here that think, actually, that's something I would really enjoy. And on the run up to that, as a part of the catering team, throwing in ideas, maybe we could do this. Maybe we could cook this. Maybe this is something that excites you. Cooking is something that excites me. If this is something, if I wasn't involved in 20 other things, I would be totally trying to head up a catering team to do this. But maybe you're similar to me in this, on that side of things. We could do loads of different types of socials. We've got a fabulous coffee shop that's doing loads of stuff. And I just want to encourage, maybe there's things that we could do utilizing that space. Maybe games nights, putting on gigs in there. Maybe doing book clubs. There's loads of ideas that we could do that could utilize that space so that we're able to do stuff together and bring friends into so that they too can be part of that. One of the other ones I want to point out is this. Meals in your home. Okay? Meals in your home. I want to ask you just to yourself, when was the last time you invited somebody from church to come back to your house for a meal? Or, even more so, when was the last time you invited somebody back to your house for a meal that wasn't already one of your close friends? I have friends who purposefully do a roast dinner that's to cater for at least 5 people, and there's only 2 people in their house. And as they leave to go to church, they play a game, which is literally, who should we invite this week to come home? And the food's already there. It's ready after church. I think that's great. I mean, maybe you've got to be that sort of person that likes to do that. But there's something in that. If we want to build friendships, it has to be more than just when we see each other on a Sunday. But actually, purposefully, intentionally doing something about it. The last thing I just want to talk about today is about forgiveness. And this is a challenge to us on this level as well. And that's this. Family, I think, is a fabulous analogy for church. Fabulous analogy for church. Why? Because families, a healthy family, families love one another, right? But equally there's friction. And families, from time to time, fight. However, a healthy family forgives and finds ways to continue to love. Yes? Which is why I think the term family is a really great analogy. The Apostle John constantly encourages his churches to love over and over again. If you read 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, by the time you get to the third letter of John, pretty much all he's talking about is love one another. And he keeps going on about it. In fact, he uses the term children when he's talking to his churches, and he's saying, guys, love, love, love. This is important. The church is a gathering of people who have Christ in common, but if we're honest, that might be it. This element of I've got so many people in a room who actually the only thing they've got in common is they've come here to worship God, and that's it, right? Yet, I think that is a fabulous foundation to build a family environment, because you've got that wonderful foundation that you're doing everything in and on and through faith in Jesus. And so this is a really great place to start. But expect bumps. And I'll point this out. No church is perfect. No church is perfect. And I would say that about Four Oaks Baptist Church, that we are not perfect. We're definitely not there yet. And I know many of you are shaking your heads gently with a loving shake, going, yeah, absolutely right. Some of you have moved to our church from other churches. And there's an inevitability that in doing so that you will have come with some hurt from the previous church. The reason that you've moved from that, maybe you've moved geographically and that you were really sad to leave your church and to come here. You've come here because of geography. But there's a fact that a lot of church growth is called church migration. It's when people leave one church to go to another. And there's an inevitability that when we do that, because something wasn't right in the previous one, that there's an element that you may come with what can sometimes be unrealistic hopes or expectations. Church is full of real people, which means that it's likely to be a place where you can get hurt sometimes by people, by things that are said, or the way that we've viewed the way that somebody has interacted with us. And I just want to point out that, that's an inevitability. But the question is, what are we going to do about it? And does that require us to say, do you know what, actually, I've let you down and I'm sorry? And sometimes it requires us to go, hey, listen, you probably didn't mean to do this, but I got really hurt by this. And for us to be able to go, okay, what do we have to do in order to be able to make this work? And I will also point out that I am your minister. Some people call me your pastor. I really don't mind what term you use. Some people, when I'm doing funerals, call me the vicar. Morty vicar, yeah. I've also been called the bearded priest. There's so many options. Anyway, but really, I don't mind what you call me. I'm Phil. You've appointed me to lead your church. There is an inevitability that I will say something that may hurt you from time to time. There's an inevitability that I might not live up to the standard which maybe you've got of what somebody who should lead a church. Do you know what? I love it when I knock on a door and I'm doing a funeral visit and they open the door. And I had this one time where the person opened the door and straight away you could just see frustration on this person's face, because what was going on in their head was, listen, I'm about to have a visit from the vicar about a funeral. Who are you? What do you want, right? And as I open my mouth to say, hi, it's Rev Phil Wilkes, I believe you're waiting to see me, you could just see that look of like, oh gosh, yes, please come in. Listen, when I'm at a party and people are asking like, hey, what do you do for a living? And I say, I'm a Baptist minister. Like, a lot of people are just like, ha, ha, ha. Yeah, no, honestly, what are you? Because I don't look like a church minister. I don't look like a church vicar. I get it. But equally with that, like, the way that we do church here is quite different to the way that churches are done elsewhere. And part of that is because actually what I bring is going to be slightly different. And I'm aware that there will be times when actually I will have said something that I didn't necessarily mean. Or sometimes you caught me on a bad day and I've reacted badly to something. There's an inevitability, guys, that as a leader, from time to time, I may disappoint. But this is about us as a family initially kind of saying, how do we work together in order to be able to walk forwards? Because again, coming back to that, the family analogy is wonderful. Because if we love, and then forgiveness, and Jesus teaches so much on forgiveness. And if you want to really feel challenged, read Matthew chapter 6. And at the end of the Lord's Prayer, read the verses directly afterwards about forgiveness. Because it's still something that haunts me. When Jesus turns around and he says, if you do not forgive your brother, then the Lord will not forgive you. Like, that is so hard to swallow. Like, forgiveness is so big that God's saying, listen, forgiveness is twofold. Forgiveness, as I forgive, I give up the pain of the injury. And so actually, I'm better for the fact that I've forgiven. But at the same time, God's saying that the necessity for us to forgive is so great that Jesus himself says of his Father that if we're not prepared to forgive, then God himself is not prepared to forgive us. That's an ouch statement. But I just want to encourage us, listen, if we're going to walk forwards and be a church that brings healing, not just to yourselves, but to others as well, it happens by us being a church that is prepared to love and to forgive. So just a quick recap of just all the uncomfortable things that we've looked at today. Listen, this year as we move forwards, we've got so much that we can achieve. But the reality is that we will only achieve this when we stop being the consumer and when we start being a part of the picture. And the question then lies on, well, how can I be a part? And so that might be financially, as we looked at that with tithes and offerings. It might be looking at the concept of the community. How can I be a part? What can I get involved in? What can I do? And I would say this I get so many people that come up to me in church and say, wouldn't it be great if we could do this? And do you know what my answer to that is? Great, get it started. We've got a great men's ministry. I've got so many people that go, wouldn't it be great if we had a wonderful women's ministry? Great, why don't you do it? You know, there's an element of like, if we're going to do this, it requires the part that we kind of do. Like, want to see stuff happen? Then get a group of people around you that can be equally as excited about it, and let's make this into a reality. Whether that's getting involved in the youth work, children's work, worship group, the welcome team, part of the catering, part of the initiatives or the various different groups. How can we get involved? Might be about inviting people to your house for a meal and actually doing life together, choosing to make church no longer just Sunday, but actually to fully be involved. Or maybe it might be about actually choosing to not carry those hurts and pains, but actually choosing to be quick to forgive, quick to love, even though it doesn't come naturally. You're choosing to work on it in order to be able to see this wonderful family that is Four Oaks Baptist Church be something of a place of healing, not just to us, but to others as well as they come. So as we looked at that verse at the beginning from Philippians chapter 3, just that aspect of, listen, leave the past and instead focus on that wonderful joy that God has got in store for us as we run the race of life. Not doing it on your own, but doing it in community together here. Challenge. Do you feel challenged? I might add, when I'm the one that's preaching, I'm the one that's equally feeling massively challenged on most of these subjects as well.